caldera of a volcano, like this Yellowstone thing. We thought it was just this crazy place with hot springs. Like, no, that's a supervolcano. That is a continent killer, a sleeping beast about to awaken. I'm merely calling for an acknowledgement of what we're watching. She's not what, and I'm not. We're talking about a 100 T wide crack that's appeared on the supervolcano underneath Yellowstone National Park. And guess what? Scientists warn us this drastic change has amplified Yellowstone's sudden eruption risk by a whopping 320%. And when it happens, it'll be a catastrophe. So let's dive right in and uncover all the details. Norris Geyser Basin and Steamboat contributing to the increased risk. But before we get into the details, let's get you brushed up with some facts. So for starters, we're venturing into the heart of Yellowstone's oldest thermal sanctuary, the Norris Geyser Basin, a blistering region with thermal features dating back a jaw-dropping 115,000 years. Here, the temperature dares to scale to an astonishing 459 degrees Fahrenheit, just 1,000 feet beneath the surface. But there's more. Here resides the Steamboat Geyser, a true testament to Yellowstone's dynamic landscape. This towering, 400 feet tall geyser used to be a rare spectacle, erupting occasionally with unpredictable pauses stretching between 4 days to 50 years. But hold on, the game changed in March 2018. Now Steamboat struts its grandeur as often as once a week. Its 32 eruptions in 2018 shattered previous records, only to outdo itself with an astonishing 48 eruptions the following year, which begs the question, is this linked to the increase in the sudden eruption risk by 320%? Let's find out. As it turns out, the geyser's erratic behavior is merely a fraction of the story. Scientists are captivated by the rhythmic dance of the basin itself. In an 8-year span from 1996, an 18-m-long strip rose nearly 5 inches, only to dip back down by almost 3 inches in the next 8 years. Then, out of nowhere, it surged up again at an unprecedented pace of almost 6 inches in a year. A powerful 4.9 magnitude earthquake shook the basin in March 2014, stalling this relentless uplift. Since then, the ground has oscillated between sinking and rising until 2019, when it finally began to descend. Yet today, the basin sits proud, standing about 5 inches taller than it did in 2000. But can there be another factor contributing to the 320% increase? You wonder? Well, the hint is a supervolcano. Supervolcano means super destruction. A supervolcano eruption under Yellowstone National Park would be unlike anything the world has ever witnessed. The biggest natural threat to human existence on Earth is posed by the 20 supervolcanoes that exist. The Yellowstone supervolcano has only erupted 3 times in the past 2.1 million years. Despite scoring an 8 out of 8 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, the 4th time might be sooner than you think. A 640,000-year-old eruption was the most recent, according to volcanologists. When that happens, an explosion will release toxic gas that would destroy crops and disrupt electricity supplies all the way to the Midwest. The United States would then experience insanely cold temperatures, as a poisonous cloud would block the sun for years. It will be the greatest catastrophe since the dawn of civilization, according to the European Science Foundation. The worst part? Cracks have started to appear, literally. In 2018, Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming closed down because of a massive crack due to a potential safety issue. Hidden Falls and Inspiration Point were closed, and park rangers carried out a risk assessment process. A source at the U.S. Geological Survey claims that the rock face crack is a typical rockfall-related risk. The Yellowstone supervolcano, which last erupted hundreds of years ago and held 240 cubic miles of rock ash and volcanic dust into the sky, as well as leaving a 34x 50-mile depression in the ground, is close to Grand Teton National Park. We're talking about a 100-foot-wide supervolcano threat crack, folks. Supervolcanoes are an ultra-catastrophe that poses the threat of wiping out humanity. Just like asteroids or nuclear or biological warfare, the world might be destroyed by the eruption. But is this being taken as seriously as it should be? Nope. There will probably never be a year in which no one dies in an aviation accident, but there will never be a year in which a single plane crash kills 10% of the world's population. In contrast to volcanic programs, the Federal Aviation Administration spends more than $7 billion a year on aviation safety. Even though supervolcanoes will kill considerably more people than plane catastrophes over the long term, we have the ability to stop these terrible catastrophes, but we choose to ignore them. And by doing this, we expose ourselves to dangers we cannot anticipate. A massive active volcano is directly over Yellowstone National Park. Pay close attention to this. Although Yellowstone has been a national park since 1872, scientists didn't completely understand the volcano's size until the 1960s. They also didn't understand that it was fully living and still posed a threat of a catastrophic eruption until the 1980s. Yellowstone has eruptions that can be thousands of times more powerful than the 1980 Mount St. Helens explosion. Several feet of ash would cover the northern Rockies. Almost everyone in the United States would be covered with ash. Now, geologists are curious to know what exactly is going on beneath all those hot springs and geysers of the national park. They naturally want to know whether Yellowstone will erupt again, when it will, and how badly. A giant eruption would be a low probability, high consequence event, the archetypal black swan with potential to have an impact on both society and the Earth. But it hasn't been ruled out completely. The issue for scientists is that these massive supervolcano eruptions are extremely unusual, and the most important thing to identify is hidden kilometers below the surface and involve chaotic forces, intricate chemistry, and mysterious geological features. Recently, the hidden architecture of Yellowstone was revealed by a research team. They simulated how lava rises from the center of the Earth and forms two sizable chambers of partially melted rock beneath the park's surface. These two magma chambers are piled one on top of the other, and there is non-melted rock between them. The lava emerging from the mantle of the Earth flows freely and contains little gas. The layer whose top is roughly 6 miles below the surface is created when it cools and hardens as it strikes a relatively cold crust. The upper magma chamber, which is located on top of the sill, is filled with explosively explosive, thick, sticky magma that stores a lot of gas. It's comparable to a shaken, unopened soda can. You know how that goes. The new study describes how this two-tiered, geochemically varied architecture might have developed over time and was published in Geophysical Research Letters. One day, we may get a model snapshot showing the system as it will appear when there has been sufficient melting to cause a significant eruption. Their model is interesting because it allows them to go through time and determine how eruption rates might have been affected many millions of years ago. The latest discovery supports past studies on the twin magma chambers bubbling under the park. Geologists also measured the speed at which seismic waves from mild earthquakes move through the subsurface rock using sensors positioned all over Yellowstone. Through heated and partially melted rock structures, these waves move more slowly, so scientists were able to create an MRI-like image of the two magma chambers using the data. It's worth mentioning that supervolcano is not a technical term. Yellowstone is referred to as a caldera, or a volcano that forms calderas. Basically, a volcano that forms a sizable crater is called a caldera, and these are mountain-eating occurrences. In fact, on the map provided to visitors to Yellowstone, which depicts the outline of the most recent caldera, it can be seen that the park's central region is unusually devoid of mountains. They either fell into the large hole or were blasted away. The first major eruption in the Yellowstone region happened around 2.1 million years ago, and the most recent one was 63,000 years ago. Is the fourth one upon us with a whopping 320% risk increase? It might just be. Then again, who can accurately predict how much magma is required to start a caldera-forming eruption? But until then, don't think nothing's happening within the Yellowstone system. as relatively minor eruptions that produce lava flows are quite frequent. The latest occurred 70,000 years ago, and Yellowstone is due to erupt catastrophically. But you see, volcanoes don't act in predictable, machine-like ways, and that alone should be a massive concern for us all. Oh, and by the way, Yellowstone is not the only caldera in the country. The Long Valley caldera in California, next to the well-known ski resort of Mammoth Mountain, is one of several worth mentioning. The U.S. Geological Survey conducts studies. It is located just east of Yosemite National Park and erupted about 700,000 years ago. So even though a large eruption is rare, it could still have minor eruptions that are very disruptive and deadly, and which might even be causing the increased risk of a sudden eruption. In fact, California has 7 volcanic areas with molten rock zones underneath the surface. On the San Andreas Fault, a magnitude 6 or bigger earthquake is about as likely to occur in California as a volcanic eruption. Now, you must be wondering what would happen if this supervolcano did erupt first. An insane amount of ash and sulfur would be thrown into the air. In turn, that might ruin crops and potentially change the environment. We know that because the enormous Mount Tambora eruption in 1815 caused agricultural failures, harsh weather, and a drop in world temperatures. The magma bubbling underneath Yellowstone is a powerful heat source, which is why there are so many beautiful geothermal features scattered around the national park, features that can be lethal if you're careless. But wait, what is it about supervolcanoes that makes them so deadly? Well, first you need to understand that a volcano with an eruption magnitude of 8, the highest value on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, and the volume of deposits for that eruption greater than 1,000 cubic kilometers are classed as a supervolcano. And when magma from the mantle rises into the crust but is unable to pass through a crack or vent, supervolcanoes form. A rising magma ball gradually builds up enormous pressures until it violently ruptures through the crust. This can take place at hotspots like the Yellowstone caldera or subduction zones like Toba. Large OUS provinces, which can cover enormous areas with lava and volcanic ash, are often connected with large volume supervolcanic eruptions. These have the potential to annihilate species and affect the environment permanently by starting a mini ice age, with calderas that were formed from massive eruptions that cover a hotspot beneath the Yellowstone Plateau. The volcanism at Yellowstone is relatively recent. The Island Park caldera, Henry's Fort caldera, and Yellowstone caldera were created by the 3 mega eruptions that took place millions of years ago. The Huckleberry Ridge tuff, formed by the Island Park caldera supereruption 2.1 million years ago, was the largest and produced 2,500 times as much ash as the Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980. Also, the Yellowstone caldera and Lava Creek tuff were both created by the subsequent largest supereruption. The smaller Mesa Falls tuff was created by the Henry Fort caldera 1.2 million years ago, but it is the only caldera from the Snake River Plain Yellowstone hotspot that is clearly visible today. As we mentioned, the supervolcano beneath Yellowstone National Park will blast ash thousands of miles across the United States in the event of another big eruption, causing damage to structures, suffocating crops, and shutting down power stations. It would be a terrible disaster. But that doesn't mean that everyone should start freaking out. Not just yet. Fortunately, the likelihood of this happening is low. And yet it's not difficult to understand why people continue to find the Yellowstone supervolcano to be an inexhaustible source of apocalyptic intrigue. A group of researchers released an article in Geochemistry, Geophysics, Geostems in September 2014 that examined the potential visual characteristics of a Yellowstone supereruption. They discovered, among other things, that the volcano was capable of engulfing the Midwest in 3 trillion tons of hazardous volcanic ash and burying states like Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Colorado. That much ash could destroy vegetation and wildlife, collapse roofs, and damage all sorts of electrical devices. After all, a 5-mile deep pool of hot lava fueled by a massive plume of molten rock rising from hundreds of miles below, is hidden beneath Yellowstone National Park. Many of the well-known geysers and hot springs in the park are the result of that heat. Although the ground above regularly rises and falls as the magma rises into the chamber and cools. In fact, that very magma chamber has erupted multiple times. The last eruption at Pitchstone Plateau took place about 70,000 years ago, and the great bulk of those eruptions in Yellowstone have been smaller lava flows. But the remote probability of disastrous super-eruptions is the reason Yellowstone receives so much attention. Any eruption with a magnitude of 8 or higher on the Volcanic Explosivity Index and at least 240 cubic miles of material ejected qualifies as a super-eruption, which means that would bury Texas 5 trillion tons under the ground. Even the largest eruptions we are accustomed to are thousands of times less powerful than these super-eruptions. Geologists have discovered evidence of at least 47 super-eruptions throughout Earth's history. So yes, Yellowstone is not the only supervolcano in the world. In fact, the most recent took place about 26,000 years ago at Lake Taupo in New Zealand. More importantly, tectonic plate movement led to the enormous Toba eruption that occurred 74,000 years ago. According to experts, that gave rise to a severe 6 to 10 degree global cold and possibly wiped off the population of that time. Although it's not an unbreakable rule, the Earth has typically experienced one super eruption every 100,000 years. So if it were to happen now, could you tell? You bet. The effects of a much larger super-eruption would be way more obvious. The entire park would definitely experience strong earthquake activity at first before an eruption. It might take those earthquakes weeks or months to fracture the rocks above the magma. What if we had a super-eruption, which was 1,000 times more powerful than a typical volcanic eruption, spewed miles of ash and debris, and lasted weeks or months? Doomsday, that's what. Within the park, the lava flows themselves would be restricted within a circumference of about 40 kilometers. In reality, only about 1/3 of the material would enter the atmosphere. Volcanic ash, slurry, a mixture of shattered rock and glass which was thrown kilometers into the air and dispersed throughout the nation, would cause the majority of damage. In their latest study, scientists came to the conclusion that an eruption would produce an umbrella cloud that would spread evenly in all directions. By examining both past ash deposits and cutting-edge modeling, the northern Rockies would then be covered in 3 feet of ash by a super eruption, which would obliterate major portions of Wyoming, Idaho, Colorado, Montana, and Utah. In the meantime, both coastlines and the Midwest will experience several inches of ash, but the exact severity of it would be based on the season and the weather. Let's be real. Any of these possibilities would be awful news. That much volcanic ash has the potential to destroy buildings, as well as harm people, plants, and animals. Even a few inches of ash, which much of the country is capable of receiving, can ruin farms, jam roads, lead to severe respiratory issues, obstruct sewer lines, and even damage electrical transformers. Oh, and most of North America would have to stop using airplanes. What to expect if Yellowstone begins to tremble tomorrow is the big question. Scientists don't necessarily know what to anticipate, but they do have a general concept, and the majority of them predict catastrophe. Let's not forget that the volcano has risen at the quickest rate ever observed over the last 10 years, and the risk of a sudden eruption has increased by a staggering 320%. Not a good sign, folks. Also, Yellowstone experiences between 1,000 and 3,000 earthquakes a year. Most have magnitudes of 3 or less, making them essentially undetectable. But these earthquakes help scientists understand how quickly the magma chamber beneath the park is expanding. And to make things worse, a recent addition of magma into the reservoir has been indicated by an increase in the shaking and rattling heard throughout the park. Following each of these eruptions, the Yellowstone supervolcano fell in on itself, engulfing the surrounding terrain, including all of the trees, mountains, and other features. If that happens now in Yellowstone, a caldera forming eruption would pose a huge natural hazard. The 50 kilometers by 70 kilometers long Yellowstone caldera itself contains some remnants of the last eruption in a region known as the Lava Creek Tuff. You can still see the thick volcanic debris that was left over after the eruption. Yellowstone is currently sleeping, and scientists are watching every cough and hiccup to try to forecast what will happen next. And even though the force that has been building beneath the park for thousands of years has been restrained, Yellowstone's hibernation does not guarantee that it will never awaken. What we need to find out is when it will happen and how bad it will be. And will it be too late? Let us know in the comments below what you think about the nerve-wracking 320% surge in the risk of a sudden eruption at Yellowstone. And if you're hungry for more thrilling content, smash that subscribe button and gear up for an adventurous journey with us. See ya.